Good afternoon. I'm going to take us through this presentation on the Child Care and Early Years Act, licensing requirements. And so I think one of the most important things is to understand what's happening in the London region and how large the London region is. So the London region exists right from Hamilton through Windsor. There are 3 offices in this London region. In London, obviously, we have 6 program advisors. In Windsor, there are 2. In Hamilton, there is 4. And then there are 1 senior program advisor. And so these folks are the folks who do licensing and compliance. And I believe the manager, Ed Durdale, has just retired. So one of the things that I'll need to do in the next little while is make sure this is up to date. So in 2016, there was approximately 1,300 licensed child care centers, 26 private home child care center agencies. And in the London region, obviously, it goes from London Middlesex right through to Cambridge. Hamilton offices is Hamilton, Niagara, and Haldimand, and Windsor covers Windsor and Chatham-Kent. These are some of the folks in the roles right now. There is a French language advisor, Shelley Stock. You'll notice in the London area we have Emily, Caitlin, Leslie, Kirsten, and Diane. You'll be happy to note that 3 of those folks are Fanshawe graduates. Kirsten is a graduate of the diploma, and Caitlin and Emily both graduated from the diploma but then continued on into our ECL degree. So it's great to see those folks working in this capacity. Next, the slide looks at the day in the life of a program advisor. And as you can see, there are a lot of roles and responsibilities. The types of programs that they review are there on the left in red. Some of the roles that they take on, which they have tried to sort of rethink in the last few years, is learning and support around pedagogical support. They look at interprofessional collaboration. Obviously, they're assisting in regulation and act understanding, and that's the Child Care and Early Years Act, which was revised in 2014. For the first time in quite a long time, previously known as the Day Nurseries Act. And again, one of the other things that the licensing advisors do is they work with the community, knowing that the London area reps attend our program advisory committee and that support our diploma program. So obviously they do monitoring, they do reviewing and processing, and they do learning and support as described on this slide. Next, you'll look at the role of the director, and the director is the director that's responsible for the Child Care and Early Years Act, not the director of a child care. So there is one director, and at the time it was Ed. I believe that position has changed. So that's just a clarification, because a lot of people confuse the word director in the Child Care and Early Years Act with that of a child care director. Directors have the authority to refuse, to issue, or renew a license. Next, there are 2 types of licensed care programs. Obviously, a child care center, full day before and after, and nursery schools. And then home child care agencies, where they have individual providers that use their own homes. The agency screens and approves and monitors, so it's the agency that actually works with the family and that is licensed, and their responsibility is to do monitoring on individual homes. Keep in mind that these Child Care and Early Years Act does not cover kindergarten programs. Home child care agencies are a person who provides private home child care at more than one location. This agency is not licensed. The agency is licensed, not the individual private home, which I just said. One of the things to keep in mind that there is information for how to obtain licenses. And so it's not an easy process necessarily to become a licensed childcare. So there is a business plan and research that must be submitted. New licenses have to go through a system. There'll be visits and meetings with the program advisor. So I think it's important to understand that getting a license requires a process. And obviously there would have to be drawings and plans and all of the building code requirements. And when we get through this PowerPoint, you're going to complete the Child Care and Early Years Act self-test, and you'll see some of these requirements outlined in that self-test. The length of a license is of time to get a license is approximately 6 months to a year, and it really depends on what the licensee is looking for. Next, we have some types of licenses, and there's a regular license and a provisional license. And basically, a regular license is issued up to a year, but sometimes shorter periods are, sometimes centers are licensed for shorter periods of times. A provisional license is when there is some form of non-compliance that the centers must meet, and when there is a provisional license, it is yellow, and a letter has to go home to all of the families in the child care center. If we look at tiered licensing, this has started to happen in 2016, and what they're looking at is based on the history of the center, that over the last 3 years, the visits will be further and further apart, and I'll explain that in a minute. So Tier 1 is childcare centers that have had very high compliance over the past 3 years, and they may be eligible to be licensed up to every 2 years now instead of every year. They still will need to submit the renewal fee every year, but they may not be licensed every year. And this is where the ministry advisors could conduct interim monitoring, just a pop-in visit and not do a full licensing. Tier 2 is when there's been a moderate level of compliance over the past 3 years and there hasn't been any provisional licenses. And so the enforcement actions would continue to receive licenses with a term of 1 year or less. However, the ministry may conduct abbreviated license renewals, so not full renewal visits. If we look at Tier 3, this is obviously a center that struggled with compliance. They may have had a provisional license, and so in this case, the ministry will be conducting more than one visit in a year. And the movement to this tier, these tier systems, basically has allowed them to spend time with centers who need more time, and those centers who have year after year after year done well, they won't be required to have as many visits. Keep in mind that licensing and receiving a clean license means that you have met the minimum requirements of the Child Care and Early Years Act, the minimum requirements. And that's really important to note. It's not about exceptional care. It's about if a child has a clean license, child care has a clean license, means it's met the minimum requirements. Tiered licensing would not be available to centers who have been operating for less than 3 years. So again, they're looking for a series of years where the center has had no issues. So the abbreviated inspection would be shorter. It would include things that have been rated by ministry staff and a sample of the childcare licensee and supervisors from across the province as being at highest risk for children. So each year there tends to be things that the ministry is looking at, whether it's outdoor play space, whether it's how records have been kept, health. So they look at these statistics and they determine each year what are the kinds of things that are that they want to look at from across the province that are at highest risk. The Child Care and Early Years Act, again, is just in its fifth year. So there have been a lot of new changes introduced in the past 5 years. With the new Child Care and Early Years Act. So it's been a bit more challenging or labor intensive for staff and centers to keep up to date with some of these changes. Okay, so you can see that the Ministry of Education website is a public website. I'm going to pull it up at some point, and it allows parents to have a better sense of the severity of non-compliance and the risk levels. So if there have been issues of compliance, you can see that on a public website, and so we'll pull that up. The ministry does not post the center's tier. Tiers are not posted on licenses or decals. This tier system is really an internal process of licensing and compliance, and they don't want to use it as a way for family to say, oh, over here they're a tier 1, they're only being licensed every 3 years, and over here they're a tier 3 and they're getting multiple checks every year. They didn't want to use it from that perspective. They wanted to use it internally to allow advisors to spend more time with centers who require it. Additionally, the inspection summary graph has been removed from the feedback because it didn't accurately reflect the compliance. So you'll be able to see on the website the information that's shared publicly. So the conditions on the license, conditions may apply to either regular or provisional licenses. These are requirements prescribed by the Ministry of Education that are additional requirements of the Child Care and Early Years Act, and they may reflect circumstances specific to the operation, such as half-day or 10-month service. So there might be something on the license that's a condition that may also be in place to minimize the reoccurrence of non-compliance, such as incomplete staff records. By the third day of each month during the term of the license, they will provide proof that a fire drill has been conducted. So that's an example of a condition that might be placed on a license. And as you know, licenses, well, you will find out licenses are kept in a conspicuous place so that family members can see those licenses. They're meant to be seen by families who come to the center. Director approval means that there are some things that the director, which is that manager of the advisors, which was Ed, who has recently retired, he can, there are some director approval, like for example, a supervisor or director at a childcare center who doesn't have their ECE, for example. There might be director approval for that, or they might not have 2 years experience, which is outlined in the Child Care and Early Years Act. And so that would be a director approval. Okay, so licensing renewal, it happens every year. And visits can last 2 to 3 hours and up to 1 to 2 days, and that really depends on the size of the program and how large the program is. During the visit, the advisor goes into children's programs. Activities are observed both inside and outside of the child care center, and so they're a complete visit, looking at files, how information is stored. During the licensing visit, there's a checklist that's completed. And the checklist is reviewed with the supervisor of the center, and all areas of concern and follow-up are reviewed in detail, and immediate concerns are addressed. The program advisor will make recommendations to the director, and then they will determine whether it's going to be a regular license with terms or conditions, or a provisional license. So there's several sections of the checklist, and these are similar sections that you're going to review in the Child Care and Early Years Act quiz. So things like ratio, building, health and medical, nutrition, program, staff qualifications, staff screening measures, emergency preparedness, and administrative matters, which is things that the center is meant to keep on file. License and signage, other legislation and ministry policy. So, what are some of the indicators of compliance? Well, they fall into three categories. There could be an observation, there could be documentation that's there or not, and then there's interviews. So the advisor is going to be observing situations. They're going to be reviewing written documentations, policies and procedures, files. As a student in a childcare center, you know that you've had to sign off on policies and procedures, and there you have to provide your vulnerable sector screen, your evidence of first aid CPR. All of those things are things that the advisors are looking at to make sure that the center is in compliance with the Child Care and Early Years Act. Multiple indicators may be used to determine compliance with a single licensing requirement. So what they're saying is that they're using multiple ways of making sure compliance occurs. In general, there must be a director-approved supervisor employed for the license. There must be a designate in terms of a supervisor's absence, and the licensee is in compliance with all conditions on the license. Written progress to monitor compliance and contraventions of required policies and procedures and individual plans. If we look at policies and procedures, these are a number of the policies that are outlined in the Child Care and Early Years Act. So you can see there's things like playground safety, anaphylactics, sanitary, sleep, serious occurrence, medication, and the list goes on and on. Criminal reference check, vulnerable sectors policy, I mentioned that already. The fire safety and evacuation procedure, there has to be a monthly fire drill, as well as now I think a tornado drill has to also be done. So you'll see these things when you go through the Child Care and Early Years Act. So what I'm doing is just going quickly through this PowerPoint to get an idea of what that advisor is looking at when they come in to do licensing. So we know that group size and ratios must be maintained, and there's been some changes in this, and you'll see that in the Early Years Act, but that supervision is occurring at all times. Supervisors is counted appropriately because we know that these are some of the changes that have occurred. There are certain times of the day where reduced ratios are possible. So I just want you to be aware that in Schedule 1, when you do the Child Care and Early Years Act, you'll have to know when reduced ratios can happen or when they cannot. So again, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail other than the fact that obviously one of the advisor's roles is to review those ratios and make sure they're being maintained based on the license and the age group that the center has been licensed for. So, of course, you also know probably and have observed that the building and equipment and playground are a big part of the licensing. So there are daily, monthly, and annual playground checks that are completed. Equipment has to be safe and clean and in good repair. You need to look at play materials. The intent is to ensure that all children have an opportunity to engage in exploration, play, and inquiry using materials that spark their curiosity and promote learning and development in all areas: social, emotional, cognitive, communicative, and physical. So again, this is going to come up in your Child Care and Early Years Act quiz. Health and medical supervision, so obviously they're looking at sanitary practices, daily health, accident reports. Is there documentation of children and staff's health, safety, and well-being? If there are staff and students trained in anaphylactic policies, and are their children's individual plans posted? Is medication on site and follows the center's medication policy? Sleep supervision policy, and this is fairly new. So again, keep in mind that the Child Care and Early Years Act was instituted in 2014. Prior to that, it was the Day Nurseries Act. And so in the last 5 years, there's been a lot of adjusting, changing, and highlighting of different policies, and the sleep supervision policy is one that has been fairly new around how infants are supervised during sleep time. So serious occurrences, that this has changed greatly, but here are some examples of a serious occurrence: death of a child, allegations of abuse, life-threatening injury, missing or unsupervised children, and unplanned disruption of normal operations. And so for the last one would be things like there's no water, there's no electricity, the hydro's out, there is an outbreak of some sort, and the health unit has said you must close your center. That would be considered a serious occurrence. This has changed dramatically over the last decade. Serious occurrences used to be anything that required, first aid or hospitalization, like a child who might have needed a stitch. Now they have changed that, and these are some examples of when the home childcare agency or childcare center must report to the Ministry of Education. Nutrition, again, this is an interesting area that you'll want to have a look at when you're doing your self-test, but there are obviously some requirements for children under 12 months, and things like drinking water must be available all the time, menu substitutions must be posted, allergies and food restrictions posted, and they need to be posted in multiple areas. So I think it's really important, now that you're in your final semester, I think you've been aware of the Child Care and Early Years Act, but now it's really important for you to be looking at some of the more minute policies that you're going to need to be aware of. But keep in mind, you also have access to all of these policies online. And I have included a link to the Child Care and Early Years Act underneath the content so that you could have a look at that before you take the self-test if you like. Program for children. Obviously, there's a number of components that we look at. Is there a handbook? Is there outdoor play for 2 hours? It doesn't say an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon. Something to think about. Children are allowed to sleep, rest, or engage in quiet activities, and is there individual support plans, and that's including children with special needs. So again, these are things to think about in terms of what are the requirements by the Child Care and Early Years Act, what are the policies, and then what are the practices that we have actually implemented. And I think outdoor play, for one thing, is something that's been practiced 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the afternoon, but doesn't necessarily need to be that way. The Day Nurseries Act, I'm falling back into my pre-2014. The Child Care and Early Years Act says 2 hours daily. So, when the summer months come and it's really humid, maybe you're going out from 9 to 11 in the morning. Or maybe it was a rainy day and at 3 o'clock the sun comes out and you spend the last 2 hours of the day outside. I think it's one of the problems with that is the reduction of staff, and when you're outside, you're not able to reduce staff. And I think beginning a day and end a day, sometimes you can reduce staff if you're inside. So these are all things that affect how we program and some of the the reasons we make our decisions around programming. Program statement was something that was new and instituted by January 2016. And this was a statement that centers needed to produce, and tied their statements to the How Does Learning Happen? And so one of the things that I'd like you to do is see if you can find a program statement, or do you remember reading the program statement at your childcare center when you did placement? What would you include in a program statement? What would the goals be? I think one of the things to keep in mind is that those program statements needed to make sure that centers really understood how does learning happen, and they wanted people to put that practice into words. When we come to staff qualifications, we know that all registered early child educators, all ECEs must be registered with the College of ECE, that there is staff training and development policy, and we know that now there's a requirement from the Child Care and Early Years Act that you do professional learning on an ongoing basis. So that's built in multiple ways. As you know, all staff have to have their first aid and CPR, which is why we ask that you have that prior to starting the program. The good old criminal reference check. We know that this has caused and changed multiple times over the years, and every organization might have different rules, but right now the standard rule is it must be no older than 6 months when received. And I think when all of you become employed, you'll need a new one, because the one you have now is stating you're a volunteer. So as an employee, you will most likely be required to get a new criminal reference check. You also must make annual declarations. In terms of saying there's nothing has changed. And so some organizations might say after 5 years they want a new one, after 2 years, but there is annual declarations that you sign saying, you know what, I have had no hits on my criminal reference check, and that it should be clean. Oh, here it is. New vulnerable sector screens are required every 5 years. So these are Child Care and Early Years Act, ministry advisors, protocols, and some of these are subject to change. Emergency preparedness, we know that this has become important, and we're doing fire drills as well as tornado drills, and so these are things that we want not to make children fearful, but to be sure that we can smoothly carry out these drills when needed. So here's the transparency aspect. So if we click on this website right here, licensed childcare website, we will be able to locate and look at what information is found on site. And so I am going to do that now to show you what it looks like. We can put in the City of London. Ontario. We can put in N6A, which is close to the we want to do child care centers, and we want to search by list and see what comes up. Okay, oh, they want a full postal code. Well, so maybe I won't do that then. Delete. Let's see if I can just do London, Ontario. Do child care center, and do search by list and see what we get that time. Well, it's showing St. John's Early Learning Center. I'm not sure why that's showing up. So we can look at that. That's on Coronation Ave, and here's the details. So you can see that the center's, when it's open, the center's website. You can see that it has a regular license. You can see that it's had 2 1-in-1 requirements. Let's look at what the last requirement, that there's conditions of the license, how many children, and we can also see here what the detail was. The license has not implemented an individualized plan under health and medical, and they consider that to be critical, but it was also resolved. So that's the kind of information that's there. And let's see if we can find another one. You can search registry childcare violations. Let's see if we look up this way, what do we get? I guess they want you to search by the name of the childcare. So you get the idea that you can go in there and you can put the name of any childcare center and see what their license background has been. And I think this is very, very helpful in transparency for families. Okay, so obviously parents need to be able to see on the website. They can also see a summary of the inspection, the checklist and the summary, and the serious occurrence form, all posted at the center. Obviously, we know there are a lot of documents. I'm coming close to the end here, and I've gone through this fairly quickly, knowing that you can go through it yourself at a slower pace and slow things down, pause, etc. But you know that the Ontario Pedagogy for Early Years, there are a number of documents online. There are a number of resources online, and you can see some of those links here. You can order individual copies of documents, but as you know, we haven't been able to get class set copies of documents in the past year. And finally, there's the portal, which you are going to go to shortly and do the Child Care and Early Years Act self-test, Schedule 1, and that's it. So I hope you enjoyed that PowerPoint, just to give you a little glimpse as to what the day in the life of a child care advisor, what happens with licensing, and I think most importantly, the transparency for children and families around keeping in mind that this licensing is a minimum requirement, and that, you know, I think the fact that a center has a clean license means that it has met the minimum requirements for licensing. Okay.